Hi, I'm Amy Pickard, a rare book curator at the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library's Central Library, and I'm here today to talk about the current exhibit, Building Buffalo, Buildings into Books, or Buildings from Books and Books from Buildings. This exhibit is running for about a year. It'll be open through March of 2018. And this tells a story of architecture in terms of its history, with books as early as 16th century and as late as the 20th century. Some are very small in scale, some are quite large, so there's something for everyone to see. The exhibit is important to Buffalo for many reasons, primarily because of the fact that Buffalo is like an architectural museum. So the architects that worked in early Buffalo, they would have had bookshelves of these important architectural texts in their offices. But in some cases, young architects couldn't completely afford to purchase a bookshelf of that magnitude and might have relied upon the library to supply that information. So both the Buffalo Public Library and the Grosvenor Library, in their day, they helped to support budding young architects by keeping these works of architectural history on their shelves and making them accessible. The Buffalo Public Library had an architectural reading room. Of course, the Grosvenor Library took issue with that because the Grosvenor Library is a reference library, and they felt that was their mission to provide non-circulating reference books. Eventually, they worked out an arrangement to have the Grosvenor Library be the keeper of those books primarily. But eventually, we're the benefactor of that competition, and the fact that the libraries saw it as part of their mission to have those books for access by young architects. Nicholas Adams, one of the guest curators of this exhibit, the Mary Conover Mellon Professor of Architecture at Vassar College, came up with this idea when he was in town doing some research in the Grosvenor Room. He spent many mornings with us in the Grosvenor Room and happened to notice, while trolling through our online catalog, that we had quite a wealth of historical architecture books. And he wrote a formal letter proposing that he guest curate an exhibit for us. And who could say no to an offer like that? He realized that at a certain point it was going to be a little bit difficult to do that from a distance, so he enlisted the help of our local architectural historian, Frank Kowski. He's, for those of you who don't know, Frank has written many books on architecture, and most recently on our park system. He is a SUNY Distinguished Professor Emeritus at Buff State in the art department. Right, a guest curated exhibit does not happen very frequently. The person or persons who offered to do this sort of thing, I think, realize the commitment involved. This was over a 2-year process. It takes a lot of communication and coordination to have something like this come to fruition. We had previously had a guest curated exhibit during TypeCon, and it was a fine press exhibit with which we worked with 2 book collectors locally. That wasn't quite as strategically difficult as this one was, because those 2 individuals were both local and they kind of knew what they had in mind. In this case, we had Nick, who obviously does not live in town, and Frank, who does, and the coordination of that was outside of our usual model. And the other thing I should note is that this was not a really defined collection within the rare book collections. it actually was scattered across multiple classification schemes, and also not in the rare book collection already and in our closed stacks. So first surveying all that we had was the first goal, and then selecting from all of those hundreds of books which would be included in the exhibit. And the result is an exhibit with over 65 books, which is pretty ambitious for us. Well, as a rule, working with small books is not a challenge, but working with both small and elephant folio size books, double elephant folio size books, in fact, is a challenge. First of all, to display the double elephant folios takes up most of a case, so you limit what else you can display with that material. And then in some of the just generally oversized books, because architecture books do tend to be oversized, to show them upright in our wall cabinets was a challenge, creating the book cradles that would fully support that top heavy weight. And then you don't really think about it so much as you're trying to overcome those challenges, but to display a small book alongside of them and not make it look like it was lost. That was something that we kind of realized at the last minute in installation, that smaller book, in order to do it justice, you needed to elevate it and mount it a little differently than you might have otherwise. If a library has special collections and they've never mounted an exhibit like this, the first thing to do would be to familiarize yourself with the strength of your collection. This was a little unique because we had an architectural historian sort of do that for us, but under normal circumstances, if you're the keeper of special collections and you're wanting to do this exhibit, it's first knowing your exhibit strengths and then examining those to determine, well, first what is displayable, what is visually interesting, what helps you tell a cohesive story, and then to consider the physical side of the books that you have identified and whether they need conservation or special mountings, things of that nature. I suppose if you're doing this for the very first time, you have to determine if you have a proper space for an exhibit like this. So you want a space in which you can display the materials well, but they'll be secure, that they're adequately lit, but that the light levels are not detrimental to the materials, that your environment, your temperature and humidity are within range, so that they're not going to cause damage to the materials, and certainly that those temperatures and humidities are not going to fluctuate much at all. So there's a lot to consider when you're thinking of mounting a special collections or rare book exhibit. There's a lot to consider when you're thinking of mounting an exhibit, but it's all worth it because sharing your special collections with the public is probably our main goal these days. I think there's been sort of evolution over the years in special collections where the role was primarily to steward and sort of hide away the collections. and today it's more about, yes, still stewarding the collections, but bringing them out into the public and allowing your patrons locally and not locally to enjoy the collections that you have. The Building Buffalo exhibit, as guest curated by Nicholas Adams and Frank Kowski, is arranged according to their design to progress through the history of architecture. So they start with the classical works, and they progress and go through the various nationalities of significant architecture. So the exhibit covers German architecture, French architecture, and so on. And it progresses to a more modern phase when pattern books were the sorts of books that architects would have referenced. And then it also has a section representing modern architecture itself. And we also have, as you walk into this display room, two prominent or significant Buffalo architects flanking either end of that progression, the historical progression. So some work of George Carey and Olaf Schulgren are presented in the end cases. There are also cases dedicated, rightly so, to landscape architecture as well. In early days, Nick and Frank had decided and felt it necessary for us to create a catalog, Building Buffalo, and this is the catalog. It's available for purchase from the library for $20. Of course, to produce a fine publication as this is, it does require considerable funding. Frank and Nick, Frank already had connections with, and Nick established connections with Catherine Schweitzer of the Baird Foundation, and she personally, the foundation, and her son Gray contributed toward the funding of the catalog and the exhibit. So we're terrifically grateful to them for making all of this possible. As you can imagine, the exhibit is one layer of expense and time, but a catalog is yet another huge undertaking in its own. There's the editing, the designing, the gathering of images, and this is rich with wonderful photography of buildings around Buffalo, landscape around Buffalo, and images taken from some of the texts themselves. There will be public programming, the extent to which we don't quite know at this time. There is a team working on creating those programs, and there will be some educational components as well. We're already starting some of the school tours that will go through the exhibit and learn a little bit about it. When we create our exhibits and when we do our programming, we're heavily aware that it's a K through 12 public we serve, and so we try to make something available to all ages. The only ways that we have to assess the success of our exhibits are through counting people, traffic. We have people counters as you enter and exit the display area. We keep a visitors register, and we invite comments, and I have to say all the comments to date have been remarkably positive and supportive. This city loves its architecture, and it really loves seeing where those ideas came from. So I think the success is sort of built in this case. And then the other I guess measure of success is anecdotal. We have people stop by and tell us how wonderful they think our exhibits are, and we actually get a number of comments from people who work downtown and spend their lunch hours in the library, and they traffic through, and they'll drop in and share their appreciation for the exhibits. So it's pretty rewarding. Oh, this is the. There's a couple of favorite. Okay, I can't say that there's one particular favorite item in the exhibit. I'll say that there are two. The Hypnerotomachia polyphili, many people pronounce this different ways, so forgive me if it's not your way, is a 1499 text that was printed by Aldus Manutius. It's a remarkable example of print history, and its connection to architectural history is because in its subject matter and in many of the woodcut illustrations, you have examples of architectural structures. Our obelisk is on display right now. It's a pretty amazing book. It is part of the architectural history, but it also belonged to individuals, and those individuals that held this book in its early days wrote all over its margins and in the pages themselves. So it's the most heavily annotated text I can think of in the Rare Book collection. It's amazing. So the other thing that I would say is my favorite in the exhibit was sort of a late discovery. We have a guest book that was in the Rare Book collection just for the sake of its binding. It's a Graybow binding. Graybow was a bookbinder who was local, and his work was nationally and internationally significant. John Larkin of Larkin Soap Company collected many of his bindings, or had his books bound by Graybow. This guest book, did not have a book plate in the front of it. It didn't say, this belongs to so-and-so. So when it was cataloged for its binding, the catalog record said that it was thought to have belonged to the John Larkin house. Well, we started looking at it as we were sharing it with Frank Kowski for his Darwin Martin house display case, and we kept seeing Martins and reed paths and people associated with the Martins, and there's an entry by Carl Sandburg, and we checked in the newspapers and found through the society pages that Sandburg was actually a guest of Mrs. Martin when he was here in town at that speaking engagement. And then we found out when their daughter Dorothy was married, in the society pages, they reported who the out-of-town guests were. So we flipped to the time period for that in the guest book, and sure enough, those guests were signed in that guest book. So that guest book belonged to the Darwin Martin house. And that was a really fun discovery. And we worked with Frank, and we worked with Jack Quinnen to authenticate this information. And Mary Roberts at the Martin House is really thrilled to learn about it. So all in all, something a few of us are celebrating. Maybe it's their favorite as well. Currently on exhibit at the library, in addition to Building Buffalo, there is an exhibit on the second floor. Building Buffalo, I should say, is on the main floor of the library. On the second floor of the library, there's an exhibit gallery space in which we have 35 of our Milestones of Science text on display. These are first and rare editions of Western science. So presented here are the works of Copernicus, early works of Newton, some first printings of the classical texts of Aristotle, Ptolemy, Galen. It's a pretty amazing collection. We had to choose 35 from about 190 some texts, which was the challenge in that exhibit, was figuring out which ones to display. And then also on the main floor, back down on the main floor, is the Mark Twain room, in which we show constantly leaves from our manuscript of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. This, of course, is the library's pride and joy. Okay, so following the Milestones of Science exhibit on the second floor, we will be opening a World War I exhibit in November of this year, 17. And that will run for another 1.5 to 2 years. And in that, we're going to be telling the story of the Buffalo home front, and that exhibit will feature our wonderful World War I posters collection. That collection was given to the Grosvenor Library many years ago by Edward Michael, and it's estimated to be some 3,000 posters, international posters. So our library is very fortunate to have some remarkable things in its public library rare book collection. I emphasize public because public libraries don't typically have rare book collections like we do. So we have something to be extremely proud of. We have the Audubon Birds Elephant Folio. It's complete 4 volumes comprised of 435 plates, and we are extremely proud to report that that was recently thoroughly conserved, completed within the last month or so. And we also have the Federalist Papers, the first edition of the Federalist Papers. It happens to be a copy that belonged to Thomas Jefferson, and it has inscriptions from him, and it tells an interesting story in its inscriptions, sort of discrediting Alexander Hamilton for the essays that he did in fact write. A little slander on the part of Thomas Jefferson. Let's see. And not to be forgotten, we have the first, second, third, and fourth folios of Shakespeare's plays, and that puts us on the map in its own right. To have the complete 4 folios is amazing, and our city is even richer in the fact that the University of Buffalo also has all 4 folios, and we recently exhibited them together for the anniversary of Shakespeare's life. I just would invite everybody who has even the slightest interest in the history of architecture and architecture in general, in books, the history of books, in the Buffalo built environment, come down and see this exhibit. It was a labor of love, and we worked on it so hard because we felt that the people of Buffalo and the surrounding areas would thoroughly appreciate it. As I say, we love the collection, and I think there are many people who will appreciate what they see.